Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, a very timely and important conversation about putting gender on the tech agenda. My name is Amelia Lester. I am the Executive Editor of Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. Gender inequality in tech is most often framed as an issue of workforce parity, but the digital revolution has created profound gender gaps in many dimensions across society. Some of the questions that we're going to be considering today are: what are the gendered impacts we should be mindful of as new tech is being developed? Are the differential impacts women and marginalized communities experience in accessing and using technology indicative of larger failures in how these systems are designed and governed? Given technology's role in our world, what's at stake when it comes to global security, inclusive economic growth, and political stability? And can existing international human rights and gender equality frameworks help ensure that technology innovation is leveraged toward equitable social benefits? These are just some of the big questions that we're about to examine. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and a big thanks to Our Secure Future for helping us make this event possible. But before we get started, we want to be sure that we hear from you, our audience. We have many hundreds of people tuned in here on Zoom, as well as watching our live streams on social media. And we've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. And here's how to write to us. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name and where you're writing from. And if you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us questions, and the address is events, EVENTS, @foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media. Be sure to use the hashtag WPS4 digital age. I'm going to spell that out. WPS as in women, peace, security, the number 4, and then digital age. And with that out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce our first segment, which features Kara Swisher, a writer for the New York Times, who has been described as Silicon Valley's most powerful tech journalist. Kara wasn't able to join us live today, but I got the chance to connect with her beforehand about our topic and the larger societal implications of how technology is designed and developed. So let's hear what Kara had to say. Okay. Hi, Kara. Thanks so much for joining us
No
today.
problem. Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk about this concept of shaking the beehive that you've written about. It's this process whereby different people in different places from different backgrounds are permitted to thrive in tech. And I guess to step back from that, my first question is, what are some of the tangible knock-on effects for women and other marginalized groups when they're having to live within this digital infrastructure that really has been designed overwhelmingly by men?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very obvious. I mean, we just had an example of that this week with Basecamp, which is a very small company, but rather influential in the tech space. And they decided, after being this sort of company culture kind of company, anti Silicon Valley kind of company there in Chicago, but they're very remote, and they've been doing all these experiments around workplace and things like that. They decided to not allow their employees to have political discussions at work, ban them really. And it's really unclear why it happened. There's something around how a diversity and inclusion committee that was started, and it really set off a real discussion about what has happened in Silicon Valley, which is they let a lot of people talk about diversity and inclusion, and they have all these meme generators, and they have all kinds of things where you could have you have an idea that you're being heard, but actually you're not being heard. And now they're shutting that down too. So it's kind of an interesting situation in that people can't bring themselves to work. And I get the issues around lack of productivity when everyone's arguing about Donald Trump. But in some ways, it's really hard to imagine that certain things like the Capitol attacks was not something you can discuss at work, and especially in a remote situation. And so a lot of people who have been marginalized and women feel like, first, they let us talk, and it didn't really change the diversity outcomes, which means that most companies are run by essentially white men. If you look at the statistics, I'm not bashing white men, it's just math, what's happening there. And now they're not they don't want people to talk as much about these issues either. So it's kind of an unusual time period for Silicon Valley.
And what about the way the products themselves are designed too? Do
Mm-hmm.
you see kind of knock-on effects there?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the whole point. One of the points I always make, and I say it a lot, is a lot of these products are unsafe because the people who built them are never unsafe or never felt unsafe. And so there was a lot of issues around Twitter, for example, around bullying for a long time. And I think it's because not everybody at Twitter, but a lot of people who were designing it didn't think about the possibilities of people doing bad things on it. I still think Mark Zuckerberg still has a sort of sunny viewpoint about the way the internet is, and didn't expect the hate speech, didn't expect the anti-vax, didn't expect QAnon. He grew up in a very nice place where he was always safe and he was always top of his class. And I think he just has this viewpoint that that's the way it should be in these online environments, and isn't noticing what's actually happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that concept of safety, because in the context of the internet, what does that mean in kind of broad terms? Is it just about, say, trolling, or
Well, it
is there a
depends.
way to think of safety as a bigger concept?
Well, yeah, it's about privacy. It's about the ability not to be tracked, for example. There's lots of ways. Like, look, Apple's doing this thing this week to try to shut that down, the tracking that happens, or trying this small attempt to shut it down. But there's things like that, like they're following you all around and you don't know what they're doing with your information. That's kind of creepy. It has a stalker kind of feel to it. There's the ability of people to attack you online in ways that are really dangerous and upsetting and everything like that. And I don't mean to say everybody doesn't, people can take a lot of guff, but most of the attacks are at people of color and women, and they can get very, as in Gamergate and other times, get very dangerous, doxing and all kinds of stuff that really sends people off these platforms that are necessary to their jobs, right? You need to be online for your jobs. And so it has, it depends on what you're looking at and what damage is causing. Obviously, there's addictive elements to it for a lot of people, for many, many people. And these are things are built. And so the way I like to think about it is a systemic, how this is systemically created in order to draw you in, and then it doesn't keep you safe once you're in. It's like a city. I always liken it to a city. I think about that Facebook takes all the rents. I'm just using Facebook as an example. The internet takes all the internet companies, the powerful ones, especially the ones that are traveling and advertising and things like that. They take all the rent. They don't provide you with police protection, fire protection, water, street signs, anything. And so you're on your own. And that's kind of ridiculous when they suck all the money out of the system. They should be doing a little better in terms of what they return to the customers.
Just to use Facebook as an example, what do you think would have been different about Facebook if it was designed by someone who, in fact, had known what it meant to feel unsafe?
You mean like Margaret Zuckerberg, for
Yeah,
example?
how would it have felt different?
I don't know. I just think he just felt, I think he has an attitude, and you hear it when he talks. He's gotten a little more press trained not to be quite so explicit about it. But I have had dozens of discussions with him where he thinks the community fixes everything. And I was like, have you ever studied world history? And in fact, he didn't finish college. No, I guess not. I mean, he's a very smart guy. But, I was like, wow, you're really naive about what you think is going to happen here versus online if you don't have the proper controls in place. And so this sort of live and let live attitude is fine when you're a billionaire, because you can afford security, I guess, and you can afford to live in a bubble, and you can afford to ignore what's being said about you. Terrible things are being said about Mark Zuckerberg online that he doesn't deserve. Some of them around his business he deserves. But the fact of the matter is he has a very sunny view of humanity. And I have one too in times, but I really am very cognizant of how these tools can be shaped from tools, which is how they see it, into weapons, which is how it often happens. And you've seen it over and over again. At this point, you're sort of like, are you kidding me? Like, are you continuing to put out products that aren't safe enough for people? And we wouldn't tolerate it in physical product. If a car just kept crashing and running over people, like and being controlled by Russians who run over people, it just would be, you'd be like, we got to stop these Russian controlled cars that are killing people, essentially.
Let's talk a little bit about how
Allegedly.
the experiences of the women who do work in tech. How do they? So we hear stories about the discrimination they face, the harassment they face, the feelings of not being safe. How does that correlate with the way women interact with tech? Is there some parallel there?
I think one thing you have to understand is these are necessary tools to be successful in life. You have to be part of the digital environment. And especially during the pandemic, it is a requirement. It's now become not just it's your home life is dependent on it, delivery or schooling for your kids or your own workplace. And so remember that you cannot leave it. This is a carnival you can't get out of, essentially a fair you can't ever leave. And so when women are working in tech, I don't think it's different. Listen, I just read a story today about a bunch of like 3 different stories about harassment in the publishing industry and in Hollywood, in Britain, everywhere. It's pervasive throughout our society, this misogyny and sexism, and not just sexism, but racism, etc. And again, I'm not trying to be like, oh, it's all over the place. There's lots of good people, but the issue is, what do we do about it when we find it and try to put things in place? And so women who work there just don't hold the same positions of authority and therefore cannot get the changes they need. And by the way, should they have to be the ones that do this? Why can't these creators also understand empathetically, think in a broader sense beyond grow? Like, what could happen here that I need to protect my consumers from? What can happen here in the workplace that I need to protect my workers from? Now, they're not going to solve this problem. This has been a problem since the beginning of time, but they certainly have the ability and the power to do more than they do.
So you've long argued that a more diverse workforce results in more innovative products. Are you hopeful, whether because of COVID or other reasons, Silicon Valley is waking up to this idea and is accepting it?
No. I think they know about it. I think they've moved on. Why should they change? Why in the world should they change? No.
So why is it so hard for them to change?
They don't want to. They're rich and they're doing successful. Why should they? It's not that bad.
So how do we shake
only one attack on the Capitol? By the way, they are not fully to blame by any stretch. Let's put the blame where it belongs. The people who actually walked in and smashed up the Capitol. Then we could say Donald Trump. Then we could say, God, they got a lot of the stuff they were watching online was a bunch of lies, and they got fed them all the time. That's the only empathy I have for them. It's hard to resist when you're getting a poor information diet, not to end up obesely stupid. I don't know what else to say. That's just what it is, or wrong-headed. And there's a real radicalization that can occur in an online environment with people who are angry or upset and need something to believe. And then in a pandemic, it just creates all kinds of societal pressures. So no, why would they change?
So leave me then with a sense of how women and marginalized groups can shake the beehive.
Get on the cap tables. Get on the investing tables. There's a lot of really interesting investors, like Melinda Gates is doing a lot of really interesting investing, focused on women investors. And get on the cap table. Get on the places where you can make a change, kind of thing. I think that's critically important. If you look at cap tables of most companies, they are not diverse in any way, and that's where the rubber really hits the road. Really, it's interesting. They really don't have to change it. Now, other industries have changed a little bit. Hollywood has changed a little bit. Finance has changed a little bit. But it took a lot. And so I'm not sure what will take a lot to get them out of this. But right now, their stocks have never been at a bigger high. They've never been richer. They've never been more powerful. Why would you change now? Nobody gives away power. You understand that you have to take it from them in some fashion. And some of it now, they're taking power in ways that are unfair to smaller companies. And so that's one way regulatory issues are brewing all around Washington, whatever side you happen to be on of the aisle in politics. Everybody is very clear that tech is too big and powerful. And so maybe that will change them. I don't really know.
Well, it seems like that kind of has to, right? Because you say they're not going to change otherwise. They basically need to be forced to change, and that might have to happen through some kind of regulatory.
Some of the power. Like, I always think if there's more players, there's more opportunity for opening things up, right? So you just if only a few companies run by the same exact homogeneous group of people run everything, you're going to get the same outcomes. So maybe they're too powerful. Like this, we've been here before as a country. Whether it's oil, whether it was, we've been through monopoly problems before in different ways and in different iterations. With IBM, there was AT&T. Once you open up the field, there's always an opportunity for different people to rise up. And look, during COVID, you saw Hollywood coming up with all kinds of Netflix coming up. Netflix really did lead the way to come up with much more diverse programming. It's very clear. It's still not where it needs to be, but boy, is it, the choices you have right now from a diverse menu across the world of entertainment is really quite astonishing, and it's been in only the past 2 years. And again, it's not enough, but it certainly is a real dent in this particularly problematic universe that existed in Hollywood. We'll have to see, and it has to be these founders promoting this stuff because they have the money and they have the means. So they've got to make sure they think it's an important thing to happen and think about when they do their investing or when they do their hiring or when they think about their legacy, I guess.
Well, I think that's a good note to leave it on with their legacy, and hopefully revisiting that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kara. I learned a lot.
No problem.
That was Kara Swisher. Now let's move on to our next segment, featuring an impressive group of women who are all steeped in this issue of emerging digital technologies and their different impacts on women and minorities, and how those impacts may be symptoms of larger systemic problems. We're also going to think about how those challenges manifest in security and policy concerns offline in the real world. So I'd like to welcome to the program this terrific lineup, Dr. Ifoma Ajunwa, who is professor and founding director of the AI Decision-Making Research Center at UNC Law, Lisa Roman, vice president of public policy at Bumble, Maura Whalen, director, democracy and technology, National Democratic Institute, or NDI, and Camille Francois, chief innovation officer at Graphica. So, Dr. Ajunwa, let's start with you. Your work focuses on the applications of technology in the workplace. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or WPS, requires women's full participation in decision making. Can you describe the ways in which women and other marginalized groups are able or not able to participate in AI development and policy development? And what have been some of the effects you've seen from this?
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to be part of this program. I'll start by saying that what we're seeing is really a lack of involvement and inclusion of women in the development of AI. As you all know, Silicon Valley is still very predominantly male and also predominantly white male. And so as a result, a lot of the decision making that go into the design of AI systems are not actually controlled by women, or women don't have as much input into the design features of those systems. I think this is particularly acute when it comes to hiring technologies. As part of my research, I look at automated hiring technologies, including things from algorithms that parse resumes to automated video interviewing. When it comes to algorithms that parse resumes, for example, you can see that some of them actually use things like gaps in employment as a variable for choosing candidates. While this might seem innocuous or might seem reasonable from the employer's standpoint to find people who have a stable employment history, unfortunately, this does actually disadvantage women, because women are generally the ones who are most likely to take leaves of absence from the workplace, whether for childcare reasons or to take care of elderly family members or provide any variety of caregiving. So using something like gaps in employment, which is perfectly legal because it's not necessarily directed at a protected category under Title VII, nonetheless can actually have a disproportionately negative impact on women. And that's just one example. There are several examples as well. But I will say that one thing we need to start with is the ground floor, which is design features. And that really goes to including more women in the tech workplace, right? So including more women who are software developers, including more women who are AI experts, to actually be at the table when decisions are being made as to design features, and also thinking through audits that can be done on these systems that would actually foreground some of the issues that impact women.
Just a reminder to everyone, as the panel discussion continues, please continue to submitting your questions using the Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. Thanks for that, Dr. Camille. Let's turn to you now. Through your extensive research of digital technologies and cybersecurity, how does the different experience of women and marginalized groups online impact broader security for everyone?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you so much for having me here. I think it's interesting to see that some of the threats that we later considered to be really important national cybersecurity threats first manifested targeting women and targeting minorities. I'll take a very clear example, which is one that I've been very close to. When we think about disinformation, when we think about trolling, I started working on these issues prior to the 2016 election, and I was working with journalists and human rights activists, and every woman I was talking to was reporting, yes, of course, we do have cybersecurity issues, but we're very worried about the disinformation that's targeting us. We're very worried about the fake accounts. We're worried about the bots, and we think it's a significant threat to the work that we do. At the time, it was not considered to be a serious threat throughout Silicon Valley. We didn't talk about disinformation much, nor did we talk about information operations, right? This idea that governments could use fake accounts and troll farms to silence and harass their opponents and critics wasn't very much something that we focused on. That, of course, changed dramatically in 2016 because of the Russian interference campaign. But before it became a national security priority, before it became a big topic for cybersecurity, it was top of mind for every single woman and minority that I've interviewed and worked with who were frustrated about their concerns being ignored. Had we listened to that, had we prioritized the threats that they were describing, we would have had less of a blind spot in 2016. That's one specific example, but we've seen this happen over and over again. I think sometimes I'm frustrated by the framing of, they're canaries in the coal mine. I understand why some, tech design folks use that, but they're not, right? They are the society that we're trying to preserve. They are the democracy that we're trying to build, and we can't ignore all the threats that targeting them and sort of constantly wake up on the other side having big blind spots because we were looking the other way. So yeah, that's from my perspective how this manifests.
Yeah, and the experiences of women and marginalized groups, these are not canaries, these are part of the public space. And if we listen to them earlier on, we can understand how to shape a better public space and one that is free from harassment and these kinds of threats. Lisa, let's go to you next. You are currently the VP of Policy at Bumble, but you started off in US government. How has your previous work on international peace and security with the UN, the White House, and the US State Department transferred to the tech industry? And I think a really important question at this juncture, having heard some about how the tech industry needs to bring more women and marginalized communities on at an earlier point in the design process, what advice do you have for policymakers and tech companies to work together better?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that the lesson learned from government that translates most directly is that we have long ago learned that women need a seat at the table in order to have successful outcomes on, for instance, foreign policy objectives, right? It is sort of now well understood that women, for instance, when are included in peace processes, in negotiating ends of conflicts, lead to more sustainable outcomes and lead to a more sustainable peace. And so I think that notion that women must be included often and early on needs to be translated more directly to the tech policy space. One thing that a point that I would love to make that I think really underscores what Camille just mentioned is that what's happening right now is there's essentially a silent pandemic of abuse and harassment that is impacting 50% of the population. We frequently survey our customers around their feelings and their experiences online, not just on our own dating products and platforms, but online sort of writ large, generally speaking. And what we have learned is that they are silently suffering abuse and harassment daily. They tell us, for instance, that intimate image abuse is something that keeps them up at night. Intimate image abuse has lots of permutations, but even sort of, I think, what society might consider the most common one or most innocuous is this phenomena where women receive unsolicited lewd photos that they didn't ask for. And, we ask them, what is the harm in receiving such photos? And of course, they tell us what I think this group would expect, that it's disempowering, that in some cases it's triggering, particularly if you are a survivor of sexual assault or harassment. But more than that, they told us that these feelings are not fleeting, that they stay with them and they make them feel less safe and more vulnerable and more distrustful of others online, generally speaking. We also ask them, well, then what do you do about this? Where do you report this? Do you contact authorities? Do you even share this with friends? And they tell us that they don't do anything about it. They don't report it to anyone because they have internalized that this is just the cost of doing business online, that they have sort of just accepted this low-level constant abuse and harassment as something that is inherent with interacting with technology. And at Bumble, we just think this is unacceptable.
We're going to talk a bit more about what you've been doing at Bumble to change that landscape and to heal that pandemic, as you call it, a little bit later on. But lastly, I wanted to turn to Maura, at least on these initial round of questions. Maura, you told me the other day that Madeleine Albright, one of the co-founders of NDI, says we can't solve misogyny through technology, but we can solve misogyny in tech. So let's keep it focused here on solutions and how to solve the problem of misogyny in tech. I was wondering, what are some ways technology and digital tools can be used by governments and civil society leaders to promote citizen engagement and to create a more just digital landscape?
Thanks for that question. And yes, I should say that Secretary Albright did start with this premise that this shouldn't be the cost to women's participation. And the digital world is representative of broader global political participation. So the very act of being female and being online is a democratic act. And if we're chilling participation, if people are feeling, if women and marginalized populations are feeling like they don't have access to the digital space in an equitable way, we've got a longer, harder road to build to reach women at the table in full participation to achieve peace and security. And so what we really need to be doing is reversing the way that we're thinking in technology policy around mitigating and preventing offline attacks because of things people say online, and instead look at designing a system that enables and prioritizes full participation. And I know some of my colleagues here on the call can talk a little bit more in detail about that. But one thing I really wanted to underline is that we're seeing a dynamic where we continue to look at this in an episodic way, that in every micro ecosystem, it is the cost of doing business. It is just one thing that happened. It's a fluke that a woman was doxxed or harassed. What we know and what the data shows us is that it's systemic and it is global. And so the minute we start and decide as a community that we're going to address this universally as a design flaw of all of technology, then we can begin to address it. So when we're talking about being constructive, we can start with women at the design table, but we can also start with the question we're asking, which is not how do I profit off of this system, but how do I create an ecosystem that is responsible to 50% of the population and the global population writ large? And that's what's going to start us down the path of creating a digital ecosystem that enables democracy. And the last thing I would say is that we have to make sure that we're designing systems that don't put the burden on women. What the other system that we're seeing, the challenge we're seeing, is that the tools we develop, the mitigation techniques, the defensive mechanisms against cyber harassment puts the burden on women and makes them responsible for their own security in this space. And we need to start from the premise again of creating systems that are safe for all people. And that's what's going to create a fundamental change that will enable the environment to thrive for women.
So we now have a good idea, I think, of the contours of the problem when women are not brought to the table on designing our digital ecosystem. We heard about harassment leading up to the 2016 election from Camille. We heard from Dr. Ajunwar about the gendered ways in which AI software is used in the workplace to discriminate against women. And we heard from Lisa and Maura about the fact that this kind of treatment is often seen as just the cost of doing business, when in fact it's very much a systemic part of how our new commons have been built to this point. So I'd like to talk a little bit more now, having established that, about how the Women, Peace and Security framework can be used to bring stakeholders together and to avoid this replication of a lot of the weaknesses of the old world. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask an excellent audience question that came in from an anonymous attendee to Dr. Ajunwar, which is, how do you recommend we encourage more women to get involved in AI earlier in their lives and careers?
That is indeed an excellent question. And I think it really goes back to elementary school education, right? How we teach math, how we promote science for women students. I think many women are capable and interested in math and science, the STEM, but unfortunately, sometimes they are having to deal with environments where that is discouraged for women, or where that is portrayed as a masculine endeavor. So I think starting in elementary school to really teach children that STEM is an equal opportunity field for both men and women, and then also providing schools, all schools, with the resources to be able to do math and science classes really well is, I think, a big factor in that. Because I also don't want to neglect the intersectionality of how women's exclusion in tech plays out, because unfortunately, many of our schools are underserved or, under-resourced, and those schools may not be able to do math and science classes that can then enable both women and minorities to then go on to college and pursue those types of fields. So I really do want to bring this back really to childhood education, elementary school education as really the base, the foundation. And then once we get to the college level, we do also want to focus on how women are included in the classroom. There's been several studies of women feeling out of place when they are pursuing STEM fields because they don't have many mentors that look like them. So there does need to be some concerted effort to mentor women who are seeking to pursue STEM education and to provide them with opportunities, whether it's internships. So that's something that corporations can take on to provide more internships for women and for minorities. So that's
I'm so glad that you mentioned that notion of intersectionality, because I wanted to ask you about how within AI, how implementing an intersectional lens can improve the security of society as a whole and not just women.
Right. Once again, an excellent question. And it really goes back to how we view science and what we think science should be for primarily. I personally think that science should be primarily for the good of society, first and foremost, and then secondarily, profit, right? So with that in mind, then, we need to think about how are we vetting the science that we are allowing to be unleashed in society? Are we making sure that such science works well for everyone. Kara mentioned, if we had a car that was always running people over, we would, very quickly, say we can't have that happen, right? We would be against that. Yet in the digital world, right, we have systems that are frequently doing the equivalent of running people over. And those people happen to be mostly women or minorities, and we somehow accept that. So that's unacceptable, right? So just thinking about when we are creating these products, right, centering everyone, not just one group that we can make the most money from, making sure that we are auditing these technologies to make sure that they don't have adverse impacts on minority populations and also on women. I'll tell you one anecdote that really sticks with me, which is that when the car industry was in its nascency, they didn't have crash test dummies that were women. The crash test dummies were all, configured to be male. So because of that, the seatbelts that were being built didn't actually work for women who are, different anatomically. And that resulted in more women dying in car crashes until that was changed. And now it is the law that, corporations who make cars have to test drive those cars with dummies of this, of both genders, or, that anatomically look different, right? So just, I think having that perspective when it comes to tech is important, right? Tech isn't just meant for one group, it's meant for all of society. So being inclusive in how we're auditing the tech that is unleashed in society is a minimum. It's a basic that has to happen.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ajunwa. Lots of important car analogies here, I think, today. Lisa, I had an audience question, which I'd like to ask you about too, just before we get to the WPS framework, which I think is a powerful way of thinking about solutions and ways to move this conversation forward. We got two similar questions, which is why I wanted to raise it. One is from Joan Johnson Fries on Twitter, and one is from Jeffrey Buchanan. Joan writes, does Silicon Valley recognize diversity increases innovation? If yes, will it change? No, why? And Jeffrey's question, similar question, what ideas do you have about promoting diversity as a means rather than an end? It seems to me that one way to help get women into positions of power is to convince the stewards of power that diversity is actually better for their organization and mission accomplishment. Clearly, that's not a problem at Bumble, but I'm curious about your experiences in the industry more broadly along those lines.
Look, I think both of those points are exactly right. Essentially, I think that as human beings, all of us have our own implicit biases, and those will inevitably show up in our work and our ideas and our suggestions and our recommendations. And so I do think there is actually a link between how diverse your workforce is and what the end result of your products are. And I do think you can hack the latter by changing the former and ensuring that there are more diverse perspectives, again, very early on in decision-making and in design processes.
I think also related to that, we got a nice question here, an interesting question from Johanna Solis from Argentina, who writes, my view is that it is not only having enough women on the table, but also that those that get there have a feminist mind and want to make changes. What are the panel's views on that? I might throw that to you, Camille.
Yeah, I think that here my view is not necessarily, which type of woman do we need at the table, but which table are we looking at? And I think Kara's intro remarks here were appropriate and right? Like, it's great to have women in the workforce, but let's look at the diversity of the boards of Silicon Valley. This is atrocious. We're not doing great in tech. Let's make sure that we not only have diversity in the staff, but that we have meaningful diversity at the governance level. That I think is valid both for Silicon Valley and for how we think about regulation. Although I will say it looks like we're doing better on the regulatory front than we are on the tech side. So I think I'm more focused on, do we have meaningful diversity and inclusion at the highest level, including at the board level, at the governance level, at the executive level? Then which type of mindset do people bring at the table?
So it's about meaningful diversity and diversity at high echelons rather than necessarily the types of women or marginalized group members of marginalized groups who are being promoted to those positions. Finally, one other audience question before I turn to some other WPS focused questions. Although this touches on that too. From an anonymous attendee, I'd like to ask more about this. Are any of the panelists able to comment on digital issues for WPS in the development assistance space? Gender assistance programming is often negatively impacted by women's limited internet access in aid recipient countries. Are you aware of any successful programs to expand access? I'm thinking about Pakistan in particular, but this question applies much more broadly. I think that question is so interesting because as we've been talking about, the online space is society now. There's no distinction between them. So if people can't access that space, it has real knock-on effects for political involvement. Maura, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think we can start a bit more broadly, and this might lead into the next layer of your conversation, which is to talk about the Women, Peace, and Security framework and potentially how it applies to tech. And it's very applicable within the development space. So inherently, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, of which 70 plus countries have Women, Peace, and Security plans and strategies for integrating women at all levels of participation in society. It's inherently multi-stakeholder. So in the case of technology, we're talking about civil society, government, and technology, and the industry, to look at making sure that women can fully participate at all levels. It's also inherently intersectional because the fundamental idea of WPS is that it brings multi-stakeholder approaches, different views to the table. So we need to be careful that we don't make this a choice between race and marginalized communities and women, but instead recognize it as an opportunity to open all doors for all people and for fuller participation of all people in society. And that's how it was intended at its founding in Beijing 25 years ago, and also where we see it going forward. So in terms of development assistance, the important thing for this audience to also know is that USAID and other US government agencies through the Women, Peace, and Security Act have created the opportunity for all of our government assistance coming out of the United States to enable women, peace, and security. So now as we implement all of our programs, to include programs that we conduct at NDI, we're looking at every aspect of our work to be inclusive and to take a WPS lens. So whether it be our work on cybersecurity, on disinformation, on governance, we're asking, have we invited all participants to the table? And the reason we're doing that is because what we find is that governance systems, whether they be online or offline, then become more inclusive and they become more sustainable. And what we're looking for is the durability of participation within the system. So, when we talk about women first having access to online, having online access, that of course is the first challenge. Often if a home in the developing world has one cell phone, it's owned by the man. But we are seeing opportunities where financial systems, governance systems are creating environments where women can participate. And the most success we're seeing is more closed spaces, right? So through digital tools, women are able to operate in more end-to-end systemic groups to find support for moving their path forward. What we learn from that is that women are finding empowerment through digital tools in different ways. And that's been very instructional for us when we talk about other marginalized communities, whether they be LGBTQ communities, different ethnic or religious minority groups in countries that are allowing them a space to convene and find one another and create power political power through those means. What we need to do is open the system to that. It needs to not be a one-off. It needs to be a mainstream and an objective of the system in order to make it more fully participatory.
Yeah, that notion of durability seems key. Dr. Ajunwa, I know you need to hop off soon. I was hoping that for a final thought, we had a question from Aline in Georgia who writes, can you share with us what problems you encountered when starting your career in the AI industry as a woman? I am from an Eastern European country where building a career is associated in this industry as a woman is associated with many problems. Just a small question for you before you hop off. Problems for you as you were starting your career in this industry?
Well, I mean, I think with any women and especially with any women of color, you will experience some challenges in any career. And I think especially when the career is one that has been traditionally male oriented or, predominantly male, then coming in as a woman, you might be met with some skepticism in terms of like, oh, what is your expertise? What can you actually bring? And I think really the only way you can defeat that or overcome that is to persevere, right? I think was it Elizabeth Warren that said, and she persisted, right? Well, so that's really the only way. You persist, right? You diligently do the work, you show up, you speak up politely but firmly, and you continue being excellent until you start getting recognized for your expertise. And then you're able to mentor other women also to join your field. And then the field becomes more and more welcoming. So that's really the only advice I can give. I don't think there's a magic pill, right, or a panacea for solving, sexism in the workplace or misogyny, apart from just being excellent at the work that you do and persisting no matter what.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ujunwa, and your persistence and your excellence. Thank you. I wanted to turn to you, Lisa, bringing it back to this Women, Peace and Security framework. This is a policy framework that requires multiple stakeholders to work together to design a better world for everyone. How can we encourage governments and policymakers to include an intersectional approach and a gender lens like WPS in the design, access, and governance of digital technologies?
So I think the first step is raising awareness. I actually applaud many governments today are taking on the enormous task of writing the next era, the next generation of internet regulation, and are really digging into some really tough questions around ethical uses of AI, about transparency, speech issues, how to mitigate harms that are not illegal, but that are not making the internet a safe and empowering place. What I think is missing is the gendered lens. And it seems to me that there are sort of two global conversations happening. One is around preventing and addressing violence against women and girls, which is a longstanding and thankfully, I think, growing in significance and resonance area of work. And then there is a separate sphere of conversations happening around internet regulation. Unfortunately, I feel like these two conversations are happening in parallel and are not overlapping. And so I think the first step is to recognize that gap, and then we can begin addressing it. But at the moment, I fear that this is not even a gap that is being recognized.
I saw some vigorous nodding from the rest of the panel on that. Maura, do you want to jump in on that point?
I think that that's right. I mean, I don't think that we've created the understanding that this is a fundamental design flaw and that there is an incentive to get it right. And the incentive is the deeper participation, the stability of our democracy, the sustainability of economies, and a number of other net effects that we're satisfied with it. The other thing that I think we fail to recognize is that we think it's something we have to invent, when what we know is that we do have multi-stakeholder systems that work, that we have seen gendered perspective brought into other industries and other practices that have delivered better results for all people. And development assistance is just one example of that in US foreign policy, but there are others. So, you know, not least of which we talked about seatbelts, but, you know, women being able to get credit cards as of the 1970s was another great example of giving people their own agency within the economic system, proved to be a boon for people like Jeff Bezos. So, you know, it is a system that can work, and we have examples of where it has worked. So there's really no reason not to apply it here. It's just a lack of familiarity that these models exist.
I wanted to also ask an audience question of, I'd like to see Camille's thoughts on this, from Susan Yoshihara. She writes, countries like Uganda used COVID-19 crises to shut down the internet and repress civil society. What are governments doing to get security partners to open up the internet to women and marginalized groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's more of a Maura question, who has a much closer lens on that. But I do also want to hear the answer to it. So I'm grateful to the person who asked it.
Thanks, Camille. Maura?
I would say, yes, we have seen two things. One is that governments have used COVID to shut down the internet, to shut down democracy. But we have seen also that the most powerful panacea we have in this case has been good governance. We've seen that transparency in the system, equity within distribution have been the biggest boon in helping communities recover. And we can look at Taiwan, we can look at New Zealand, we can look even in the West at some of the efforts that have been made. But we should recognize that what we are ultimately seeing is that anything that is inclusive, whether it be welcoming women into the system in a more holistic way, whether it be democratic systems, fundamentally, they're a threat to authoritarian regimes. And we should understand that these concepts go hand in hand, that the very principle of women, peace, and security being multi-stakeholder, and welcoming civil society and welcoming alternative voices is a threat to authoritarian regimes. And so it has to be fundamental to our decision making. We can't have democracy without women. We can't have good governance without democracy. And so COVID has proven to be the global shock that is teaching us this in real time. And unfortunately, when we see it lacking, such as some of the governments we're looking at around the world, it's a life and death question. And it is one that is impacting women and marginalized communities disproportionately.
That is such a potent idea that that you brought out there, that the women, peace, and security framework, by definition, because it invites and in fact demands to hear from multiple voices and from multiple stakeholders, is in itself a kind of bulwark against totalitarianism or repressive regimes. So thank you for that, Maura. And I wanted to ask Camille one last final question before we thank the panel and turn to Sahana for takeaways. And that is just to consider the really big picture in our final 30 seconds, Camille. In the age of digital technology, how is gender a global security issue?
Yeah, and I think that as I think through the answer to that question, I was thinking about what Lisa was saying, right? When we have women and minorities everywhere who have internalized that level of toxicity and harassment and violence is just the cost of doing business, that this is no longer addressed and no longer reported. What is the price that we're paying as societies, as democracies, on a global level? What is the price that we're paying in terms of women not running for office, of women not pursuing journalism careers because it is so much more violent for them to do that, of minorities not participating in public life. And I think that really is the question. What is the unseen cost of this level of violence that we know exists, we know isn't addressed, and is often direly unreported?
Thank you so much, Camille. I think that's a great question to leave the panel on today. What is the hidden cost of not including women and marginalized groups at the table? And then I think the question from there is, where do we go from here, having established that hidden and quite devastating cost? So thank you to our panel. It's been a fascinating conversation. But before we go, I want to invite to the Zoom stage our final speaker, Sahana Dharmapuri, who is the director of Our Secure Future, a program of One Earth Future Foundation. Previously, she was an advisor on gender, peace, and security issues to USAID, NATO, the Swedish Armed Forces, the United States Institute for Peace, and other international development organizations. Welcome, Sahana.
Thank you so much, Amelia. And I have to say thank you so much to the panelists for the terrific conversation.
Sahana, I'm curious, what are some of your key takeaways from that conversation just now with the panel?
Well, what I really appreciate is that I think the panel, the keynote address, all confirms the findings that my co-author Jolyn Shoemaker and I produced in a report that we did on this topic called Project Delphi, looking at the tech space with the women, peace, and security lens. And I would say the number one thing that I would take away from this conversation is that the gendered problems, the problems of online abuse, human rights-based problems in the workplace, these are all actually very strong signals of systemic design flaws in the tech space and the digital age that we are all creating together. We're living in it and we're creating it at the same time. And we are unwittingly replicating the negative aspects, some of the negative aspects of our sort of in real life experiences into this new digital space and world. But I think the other key takeaway from this conversation is that the women, peace, and security narrative and policy framework actually shows us that we do not have to be victims of this new digital age and space. And in fact, we are the authors of it, and we can design a better system, and we know how to do that, using the framework. I think a lot of the points, the very individual, the insights that each of the panelists brought out from, the targeting of women and minority groups first by nefarious actors, and how that shows up later as a security problem for everyone. The inability or the inaccessibility of the tech environment for women and minorities, how that shows up later in the tech industry. That there is actually a financial cost to companies when they do not consider that at least 50% of the population can't access or participate in the products and the spaces that they're making. And I think I read somewhere that Jeff Bezos is, the 73% of Amazon online consumers are actually women. So that would be, really devastating to a huge company making a lot of money to continue the design flaws in their systems because that's who their consumer base is. That's where they're getting the money from. So I think, to me, those are some of the really big takeaways from what I heard. I think also one of the pieces of why we wanted to have this conversation with everyone is to really underscore that women, peace, and security shows us with this lens that now is the time to address these issues. Just like in post-conflict reconstruction stages and countries, this is the time when we are building infrastructure, when we are writing policies, where we are writing new laws, we are thinking about these issues very deeply. This is the moment in time that we need to bring those diverse voices into the conversation. And that this is not a women's issue, that this is really about applying a human rights-based approach to security. So those are the things that I take away, and I hope others take away in the audience as well. And one last thing, if I may say, that I think the point that Maura made at the end of, within the framework, consultation with everyone, bringing in multiple stakeholders to solve governance problems and decision-making problems. This is key to women, peace, and security, and is very applicable to this field of the digital age, right? And I would say our Secure Future is very interested in continuing that conversation and bringing together private sector, civil society, governance actors to really dig into these issues.
Thank you so much, Sahana, for that rousing message that now is the time. And unfortunately, our time today is up. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. And to all of our presenters, it's been my pleasure to speak with you all. Thank you so much for joining us to share your perspectives. A special thanks again to our Secure Future. They partnered with us on this dialogue. They helped us to explore this new perspective using WPS on the future of technology and global security. And last but not least, thank you to you, listening and watching at home. Thank you for being so wonderful and submitting so many interesting questions. Please stay tuned for much more to come from FP soon, including a special event tomorrow, Mapping Power Players Across the Biden Administration. That's a special event that will take place tomorrow, Friday, May 7 at 11 a.m. And more virtual dialogues later this month coming up, including how to stop vaccine misinformation, and another on the role of space-based technology for intel and humanitarian operations across fragile environments. We are tackling big issues here, and we hope you will join us. Find out more on foreignpolicy.com/events. Take care. See you soon.